Okay, I posted a paper I wrote. It's actually part of my dissertation, and I kind of pulled it out and wrote it out about how you use trade, your ability to interrupt trade between you and another nation in order to have an effect on them. And the specific question, it's a very narrow question that the paper looks at, is what are the economic conditions necessary for one nation's cutting off of trade, bilateral trade between the sanctioner and the target. What are the economic conditions that need to be in place for that severance of trade to have an impact on the target? And in the literature, you find a lot of people assume that they'll make various assumptions. Some will assume that the size of the sanctioner versus the target is important, and clearly a large sanctioner versus a small target will be significant. Other people will say, well, no, it's not the size of the sanctioner, it's the size of the trade. And if you look at the amount of trade between the sanctioner and target, and you say, well, if that's cut off, what's the loss to the sanctioner, what's the loss to the target? And some people will say, and by the way, when I say some people, I'm really on people about citing, in your papers, when you say some people, you have to cite. In my paper, I hope you'll find that I, in fact, name the names of people that say these various things. But what you have is generally this fairly simplistic assumption out there that, well, the cutting off of trade is what's at stake, and so if there's $20 billion of trade, let's look at that, and maybe they'll scale it to the size of the economy and say, okay, for the sanctioner, it's 2% of their economy, for the target, it's 10%, so clearly it's more of a problem for the target than the sanctioner in that case. These things, in my paper, I kind of discuss those, and I say, well, that's not really the way it works. And to get at the question of how severance of trade plays out, I use a three-nation trade model, and it's basically the sanctioner and the target and the rest of the world. All right? So we basically reduce the world to three nations: the sanctioner, the target, and we lump everybody who isn't a sanctioner or target into rest of the world, or row. Okay? And the paper goes and lays out the model and gets through it. And I'll just cut to the chase and say that the significant condition, the significant factor here, is what's the amount of bilateral trade between the sanctioner and the target versus the production of the goods that these two trade in the rest of the world. And it turns out that you can't just look at sanctioner versus target, and you can't just look at their trade and compare it to their economies. What you have to do is you have to look at the level of trade between the sanctioner and the target, and you have to also look at what are they trading, okay? Because they're trading particular goods, and you have to say, well, if the sanctioner cuts off trade in, let's say, you're trading between nations, and let's say the trade is televisions. Okay, if the sanctioner is importing televisions from the target, and they cut off that trade, what happens is the market tries to sort this out. We live in a world with free markets, and essentially all the people in the sanctioning nation that would normally have bought TVs, presumably they still want to buy TVs, and they're going to go out and they're going to search for other TVs, and they're going to go to row the rest of the world, and they're going to say, well, we used to get TVs from the sanctioner, or from the target, excuse me, and we're now looking at the rest of the world. If in the rest of the world there's a lot of production of television, meaning more than the sanctioner would normally import from the target, then what happens is the sanctioners, the consumers in the sanctioning nation, just go to the rest of the world and they buy TVs from the rest of the world. And, so they buy the TVs. The sanctioned nation still gets as many TVs in, and so they really don't suffer any significant loss except for minor temporary disruptions in the flow, right? So there may be some adjustments that have to be made, but in the long run, they still get their TVs. For the target, which is an exporter in this little example, they simply export TVs to the rest of the world because the sanctioner is now buying up TVs. So there's now, there are fewer TVs in the rest of the world because the sanctioner is now buying them from the rest of the world instead of the target. And so the target exporters just simply sell their TVs to the rest of the world, to the people who would have bought the TVs that the sanctioner is now buying. And so in this case, where the trade flow between the sanctioner and the target in the particular goods is less than the production of those goods or the trade of those goods in the rest of the world, what we end up as a result of sanctioning is simply a diversion of trade. Okay, it goes and we just change the trade patterns, and there's really not a significant long-term loss. Okay, and that happens very often, and it's likely to happen when you have a sanctioner, especially if the sanctioner is just one nation. I mean, even if it's the United States, how many TVs does the United States buy versus what's sold in the rest of the world? It could be significant, especially if production of goods is concentrated in a few nations. It could be significant, but it might not be. And so you could just end up with trade diversion, especially if the target is a small nation. If you're sanctioning Liechtenstein, what does Liechtenstein make that isn't made anywhere else in the world that we can't replace the trade of? A small nation is going to only trade a small amount with the sanctioner to begin with. And so with a small nation, even if the sanctioner is a large nation, if it's a small nation we're talking about targeting, well, it's very likely you can replace the imports from that nation from the rest of the world. And so that's one of these interesting things, is when you have a big nation sanctioning a smaller nation, it may be that there isn't any real trade impact, right? Which is kind of counter to what we think of in power. We tend to think big means powerful, big means having lots of influence. And here it's like, and more importantly, we tend to think when there's a disparity, right? I should be saying bigger sanctioners versus little targets, we tend to think, oh wow, they got lots of power. Turns out, well, maybe not, right? It's a question. Clearly, if the United States were sanctioning, say, Japan on any particular thing, could you buy the stuff that Japan makes? Or now today, China. Could you find production from a large target in the rest of the world? Could you find equivalent production elsewhere and just replace it? So this is one part. And very often a cutting off of trade just produces a diversion of trade. And even when the sanctions end, there are a lot of cases in the Huff-Bauer-Schott and Elliott database where sanctions are imposed, and when they end, the trade never really goes back. I've looked this up and looked at cases, and very often you'll see that the trade just doesn't go back because they get it from the rest of the world, and the trade pattern shifts and nothing else happens. Now, when the bilateral trade between the sanctioner and the target is large, right, and there isn't a lot of other production in the rest of the world, then you see that there is a cost, right? A good example would be large aircraft, right? There's really only two producers of large commercial aircraft around the world, Boeing and Airbus. And if the United States were to say sanction China and say, hey, China, we're not going to trade with you, and we're not going to let you buy our Airbuses. The question is, let you buy Boeings. The question is, well, can China go and get as many Airbuses? Whatever they're going to buy from Boeing, can they actually go out? Can Airbus make those planes for them? Is there enough there? And that's a question. It's kind of hard. Well, I don't know. The thing is, when you have the key thing for having an impact through your sanctioning is when the volume of trade is high compared to the amount of production in the rest of the world. And so, it turns out that when large nations sanction each other, it's far more likely that the volume of trade between them is, if it's high, as it would be with larger nations, it's less likely that you're able to go out and find the products you need, and just be able to replace them. And as a result, paradoxically, you find that when large nations sanction each other, there is more likely to be an effect, right? So the United States is more likely to have an impact against its major trading partners like China, God forbid Canada. There's a lot of stuff that just goes back and forth between Canada and the U.S. that really couldn't be replaced because it's just such a high volume of trade. But China, Japan, these other countries, we're likely to see there's a big amount of trade, and you just can't replace it from the rest of the world. Now, I'm talking about a sanctioner. When you have a sanctioning coalition, that can be a big part of what makes multilateral sanctions more effective, is you get partners who trade in those goods. So, if the United States were to try to sanction China by withholding large commercial aircraft, the United States would really do a lot better if it got the European Union involved, right? Because now if you had both producers of large commercial aircraft, you could say to China, hey, we're going to cut you off, and you need these aircraft, and we kind of have a lock on the production. You can't go anywhere else. And so this is one way in which having multilateral sanctions helps, because what you want to get is you want to get sanctioning allies who are either buying the same stuff or trading in the same things or producers of the same things, and you want to get them on board so that the volume of trade between the sanctioning coalition and the target is greater than the production in those goods around the rest of the world. And that's really significant. It also points out that, when we talk about smart sanctions, particular goods are more concentrated in their production, and my example of Boeing is there. But also, if you look at things like TVs, how many nations make TVs? And if you're importing TVs from the target and you want to cut that off, you say, well, the target's a major exporter of TVs. Who else buys TVs from these guys? You look around, you buy a lot of TVs, you buy a lot of, together, the amount of TVs we buy is greater than what the sanctioner, what the target produces. And even if these other nations don't particularly buy from the target, by adding them to the sanctioning coalition, you kind of prevent the trade from diverting to them, and you have an impact. When you do have an impact, it has to be pointed out that both the target and the sanctioner, or the sanctioning coalition, suffer a loss, right? In the case where the target would be, say, exporting the TVs, when the sanctioners, if you have enough people sanctioning that, you don't have the trade diversion, what happens is, well, there's kind of a shortage of TVs, so the price of TVs will go up in the sanctioning coalition. Meanwhile, the target, faced with this problem of having a lot of TVs to move and not really anybody to buy them, because everyone that would potentially buy them is part of the sanctioning coalition, they come back and they go, well, we got to sell these things at fire sale prices. We got to cut the price and sell it. So this is what happens when you do have an impact, is the sanctioner has higher prices for the imports, and if it's exporting to the target as well, which is less often the case. Usually you sanction your imports, you boycott rather than embargo people usually. But if you are embargoing someone, if you have a big enough coalition, you're going to suffer a loss, a decrease in the price of your exports, which is a loss to you. On the target side, the things they export are now cheaper, so they're getting less money. And if they're importing and you're embargoing them, then they're paying a higher price for it. So both, when trade sanctions have a bite, they bite both people, right? That bite is, realized in different prices, and it is kind of a loss in trade. And so, you never have one-sided sanctions. It's an important thing to understand. However, in some ways, people are less sensitive. If the United States stops importing TVs, if there were domestic manufacturers of TVs, which there really aren't in the United States now, but if there are domestic manufacturers, or if there's members of the sanctioning coalition who produce TVs, right, but now are not going to trade have just gotten on board, they're going to have a benefit. So, I mean, there will be particular groups that benefit from these higher prices, and so they can support the sanctions. But generally, the consumers are going to pay the price. And so it tends to be kind of a diffuse cost. In case of the the target of the sanctions, if their imports are now, selling less, you might shut factories down, you might put people out of jobs. So the price there to those guys would be concentrated. Of course, we have to say in the target, in this example, the consumers in the target who buy TVs domestically, they're the prices dropped, right? So they're going to actually benefit from that. Although it'll be a diffuse benefit and less likely to have a political impact. So, I mean, this just gives you a sense that there's the costs are distributed economically. They affect different groups in different ways. They are, and I think the big thing is what parameterizes whether or not you have a cost to sanctioning is not the size of the sanctioner versus the target, right? Or not the size of the trade versus their economy. It's the size of the trade versus the rest of the world, right? So now we have a totally different thing. It's not a bilateral ratio. It's a kind of a global ratio, right? What's the trade between the sanctioner and the target and the rest of the world? That would be my dog messing up my video. I hope you all, hope this is helpful to you. You do have the paper that you can read and you can see in greater detail what I'm talking about. But if you just watch this and if it's clear from what I've said, well, that's probably enough to get you where you need to go. Okay?